The Great Depression wasn't just about empty wallets, it was about quick thinking. With little money and few jobs, people had to get creative to make ends meet. They found ways to make things last, solve problems on the spot, and keep going even when times were tough. These smart hacks didn't just help them survive, they made them stronger. Kicking off this survival guide, we have food stretching. Food didn't expire back then. It just got promoted to a different meal category. Families developed ingenious methods to make meals last days longer than nature intended. That pot of Sunday stew? By Wednesday, it was barely flavored water, but it still filled empty stomachs. People added a potato here, an onion there, until that original chicken was just a memory floating in broth. Meat became the magical disappearing act of every household. A single chicken could feed a family for nearly a week. First as the star of Sunday dinner, then shredded into Monday's soup with bones simmered for Tuesday's broth. The chicken had a longer farewell tour than most bands today. By Thursday, people were pointing at floating specks in the soup saying, "See? There's still some chicken in there." Families mastered the art of bulking up ground beef with oatmeal, breadcrumbs, or crushed crackers, anything to make that precious protein seem more substantial. Meatloaf became so full of fillers that cows couldn't even recognize it as a distant relative. Kitchen waste simply didn't exist. Potato peels became crispy snacks, apple cores turned into vinegar, and bacon grease was liquid gold, saved in cans to flavor everything from beans to cornbread. People guarded their grease cans like we protect our phone passwords today. Stale bread transformed into bread pudding or was ground into crumbs for coating tomorrow's meal. But food wasn't the only thing that needed creative handling during those tough times. Clothing during the Great Depression transformed necessity into creativity. When money was scarce, wardrobes didn't expand. They evolved. A single garment might serve 3 or 4 family members before finally being cut into rags or quilt squares. The phrase hand-me-down wasn't just for kids. It was the family fashion business model. Flour companies accidentally became clothing manufacturers when they discovered that women were using their sacks to make dresses. Responding to this trend, mills began printing their cotton bags with floral patterns and pretty designs. By the mid-1930s, an estimated 3 million women and children were wearing garments made from flour sacks. Shoes presented a particular challenge. When soles worn through, cardboard inserts became the temporary fix. Children often went barefoot in summer, not as a carefree choice, but to save their only pair of shoes for school and church. Kids measured the success of their day by how many toes weren't poking through their footwear. Mending became an art form. Patches were carefully placed, holes were darned with precision, and frayed collars were turned inside out to extend their life. Buttons were among the most recycled items, carefully removed from worn-out garments before they were repurposed. Many families kept a button box filled with these small treasures, ready to give new life to a shirt or dress. Closets weren't filled with options. They contained solutions. While today we discard clothes for being outdated, Depression-era families simply couldn't afford such luxury. Fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about looking clothed. These clothing innovations were impressive, but when money was truly scarce, people turned to an even older system than cash. Bartering became the economy of necessity when cash disappeared during the Great Depression. With unemployment reaching 25% at its peak, many Americans simply had no money to spend. What they did have were goods, services, and skills to trade. The ancient practice of swapping one item for another made a dramatic comeback across the country. How did it work? The local doctor might accept a chicken as payment for setting a broken arm. A seamstress could mend clothes in exchange for vegetables from someone's garden. Farmers would trade milk and eggs for help with harvesting. The expression, "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine," wasn't just a saying. It was practically economic policy. Communities developed complex webs of mutual support through these trades. Studies of Depression-era bartering showed that small towns could maintain over 80% of their economic activity without using actual currency. Neighbors kept mental ledgers of who owed what to whom, creating informal credit systems based entirely on trust and reputation. Children quickly learned the art of the deal too. A skilled young barterer could trade marbles for comic books for candy, and candy for homework help. Kids became tiny business tycoons without a penny in their pockets, Wall Street bankers with skin knees. The most successful barterers understood value wasn't fixed, but negotiable. A loaf of bread might be worth different things to different people depending on their needs. Someone with plenty of food but a leaky roof would happily trade dinner for repair work. But even in a world of trades and swaps, some things were worth more than goods or services. Free entertainment during the Great Depression became a masterclass in creativity. When a quarter of Americans were unemployed and the rest barely scraping by, leisure activities that cost money were the first luxury to go. Families discovered or rediscovered the art of amusing themselves without spending a cent. The radio stood as the centerpiece of home entertainment. By 1933, over 60% of American homes had a radio, despite the economic hardship. Families gathered around these devices each evening like a modern ritual, listening to shows like The Shadow or President Roosevelt's Fireside Chats. If the electricity bill couldn't be paid, neighbors invited each other over, creating the original streaming party. Except nobody complained about buffering. Card games experienced a massive revival. Euchre, bridge, and pinochle tournaments would occupy entire neighborhoods on Saturday nights. The stakes weren't money. Perhaps the winners got an extra slice of pie or first pick of the hand-me-downs. Children invented games using whatever was available. A stick and a can became hockey equipment. Rocks and chalk marks on sidewalks transformed into hopscotch courts. Jump rope rhymes passed down through generations got new verses about hard times. Kids played store, but instead of pretending to buy things, they practiced haggling and bartering, preparing for their future economic reality. Music making flourished as families created their own entertainment. Someone would pull out a guitar, harmonica, or sit at the piano if they were fortunate enough to own one. Those without instruments would sing or whistle or tap rhythms on the table. The Depression years saw a boom in folk music, with songs that told stories of struggle and perseverance. While entertaining themselves at home, people also had to focus on a more urgent concern. Victory gardens became the frontline defense against hunger during the Great Depression. If you had a patch of dirt, you were instantly drafted into the ranks of amateur farmers. These weren't the cute Pinterest-worthy garden boxes we see today. They were serious food production operations that could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. In cities, any vacant lot quickly transformed into a community garden, while suburban and rural families could dedicate larger areas to food production. People who couldn't tell a weed from a carrot suddenly became plant experts. Amazing how quickly you learn botany when your stomach depends on it. Growing food was just the beginning. The real magic happened when harvest time came and preservation began. Canning became a crucial skill as families worked to make summer and fall bounty last through winter. Mason jar companies reported sales increases of over 300% during these years. Kitchens transformed into mini factories with assembly lines of washing, cutting, boiling, and sealing. Root cellars, those dark, cool spaces under houses or dug into hillsides, became treasure vaults filled with potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples. Temperature and humidity were carefully monitored to ensure nothing spoiled. Urban dwellers without cellars got creative, using cool closets or insulated boxes as makeshift storage. Seeds became currency, carefully saved from successful plants for next year's planting. Neighbors would trade their best varieties, their tomatoes for another's green beans. Garden pests weren't just annoying. They were stealing food off your table. A single cabbage butterfly could become a personal enemy. When gardens couldn't provide everything needed, people had to develop another critical Depression-era skill. Repair skills during the Great Depression transformed from optional talents to essential survival tools. When something broke, replacing it simply wasn't an option for most families. The repair-first mindset became so deeply ingrained that it persisted for generations afterward. Ask anyone who grew up with Depression-era parents. They'll tell you about drawers full of spare parts and the family motto, "We might need that someday." What did this look like in practice? Take automobiles, for example. Car owners became amateur mechanics by necessity. A 1936 survey found that over 70% of car repairs were done by the owners themselves rather than at garages. Cars from this era were basically rolling science experiments, held together with wire, hope, and whatever metal scraps could be salvaged from other broken machines. Household appliances received the same treatment. When the washing machine motor burned out, families didn't shop for a new one. They rewound the motor themselves. Detailed repair manuals became bestsellers with titles like Fix It Yourself and Save, selling over 1 million copies. Tools became prized possessions, often shared among entire neighborhoods. A community might collectively own specialized equipment like soldering irons or welding torches. Borrowing a neighbor's tools created a social obligation to help with their repairs when needed, a specialized form of bartering. If you ever wondered how your grandparents can fix anything with a piece of string and a nail, now you know why. They weren't born with repair genes. They developed these skills because the alternative was going without. Modern upcycling would have seemed obvious to them. Of course, you turn a broken chair into a stool. That's just common sense. As homes became filled with carefully maintained and creatively repaired items, many families took their skills a step further. Home-based businesses weren't trendy side hustles, they were survival strategies. With formal jobs scarce and incomes plummeting, families transformed their living spaces into impromptu commercial enterprises. The side hustle wasn't invented by millennials with Instagram accounts. It was perfected by grandparents trying to put food on the table. Did your grandmother have impeccable sewing skills? Her living room likely became a neighborhood alteration shop. Could your grandfather cut your hair? The back porch transformed into a weekend barbershop. Record keeping from the era shows that as many as 1 in 4 urban households supplemented their income through some form of home enterprise. When the economy went south, everyone suddenly discovered their inner entrepreneur. Amazing how quickly talent develops when dinner depends on it. Kitchens became commercial bakeries as women sold bread, pies, and cookies to neighbors. 1 loaf kept for the family, 5 sold for income. A 1933 survey in Chicago found that home food production businesses had increased by 300% since 1929. Handwritten recipe cards became business plans with careful calculations of ingredient costs and profit margins. Many families took in boarders, renting out spare rooms or even couch space to travelers, workers, or relatives who had lost their homes. Records show that by 1932, approximately 30% of urban households had at least one paying guest. Suddenly, every home became an Airbnb, except the listing photos would have been a lot more honest about the accommodations. Front yards transformed into miniature farm stands. Back rooms became production spaces for handcrafted items. Even children joined in, running errands, delivering goods, or helping with production. Every family member became part of the workforce, regardless of age. While these home businesses helped put food on the table, another challenge awaited in everyday life. Soap conservation became an art form during the Great Depression when even basic hygiene products were considered luxuries. Families developed creative techniques to make every sliver of soap last as long as humanly possible. Soap bars were used until they became paper thin, then collected in a jar with water to create a gelatinous goop that would eventually be formed into a new Franken-soap bar. The numbers tell the story. Soap consumption dropped by nearly 40% during the Depression years, yet hygiene-related diseases didn't spike proportionally. People weren't using less soap because they had given up on cleanliness. They had simply become masters at stretching their supplies. A Depression-era bathroom cabinet would make modern minimalists look like hoarders. Daily bathing. That modern luxury disappeared quickly when soap became precious. Most families adopted a weekly bath schedule, often using the same bathwater for multiple family members. The pecking order mattered. You definitely wanted to be first in line rather than bathing in what was essentially the family's collective soup. Laundry presented its own challenges. With commercial detergents often out of reach financially, resourceful homemakers made their own washing solutions using lye extracted from wood ashes combined with saved cooking fats. These homemade soaps were effective at cleaning, but notoriously harsh. Clothing might be clean, but your hands paid the price. For dishes, a single small piece of soap could last weeks by keeping it in a wire cage or mesh bag, swishing it briefly in the wash water to release just enough suds to do the job. Some families would only use soap on eating surfaces of dishes, merely rinsing the exteriors with hot water. As challenging as managing soap supplies could be, there's another fundamental test of Depression-era ingenuity. Staying warm during winter became a serious challenge when heating fuel was either unavailable or unaffordable during the Great Depression. Families developed remarkable strategies to survive freezing temperatures without the modern conveniences we take for granted. The battle against the cold started with clothing, not fashion choices, but survival tactics. Layers were the foundation of winter warmth. People didn't just wear one sweater, they piled on every piece of clothing they owned. Families wore so many layers indoors they basically became human quilts. A typical winter outfit might include 2 pairs of socks, long underwear, a shirt, sweater, jacket, and any additional garments that could be squeezed on. Moving around resembled a slow-motion dance, but the extra bulk kept the bitter cold at bay. For sleeping, ingenuity reached new heights. Bed warmers were essential tools, often just bricks heated by the stove, wrapped in cloth, and placed between the sheets before bedtime. As the night grew colder, these primitive heaters provided just enough warmth to prevent frostbite, if not complete comfort. Your toes might still feel like ice cubes, but at least they remained attached to your feet. Studies of Depression-era housing show that the average indoor temperature in winter hovered around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in many homes. To combat this chill, entire families often slept in a single room, sometimes even sharing beds. Body heat wasn't just a scientific concept, it was a crucial survival resource. Window insulation consisted of whatever materials could be found: newspapers stuffed into cracks, old blankets hung over drafty frames, or cardboard covering broken panes. Some families even pasted magazine pages directly to walls as an extra layer of insulation against the biting wind. But when resources were this scarce, nothing could afford to be single-purpose. Repurposing everyday items during the Great Depression elevated creative recycling to an art form. Nothing was ever truly useless. Objects simply awaited their second, third, or fourth lives. This wasn't trendy upcycling for social media likes. It was the difference between having what you needed or going without. Tin cans became the Swiss Army knife of Depression-era households. Once emptied of their original contents, these metal cylinders transformed into everything imaginable: cookie cutters, candle holders, toy cars, and even makeshift stoves. A survey of rural homes in 1934 found that the average kitchen contained 14 repurposed tin containers serving various functions. These weren't just cans anymore. They were retirement homes for beings that had moved on to a more purposeful afterlife. Newspapers and magazines enjoyed extensive second careers. Before becoming fire starters, they served as gift wrapping, home insulation, pattern-making materials for clothing, and even toilet paper alternatives. A 1932 study estimated that the average newspaper was handled at least 7 times before its final disposal, a stark contrast to today's quick-to-recycle habits. Feed sacks and flour bags found new purpose as clothing, as we've seen, but the wooden crates they came in became furniture, storage bins, or were disassembled for lumber. Shipping pallets, the ancestors of today's DIY pallet furniture, were broken down to build chicken coops, repair barn walls, or create garden fencing. Even broken items retained value. A cracked bowl became a planter. A chair with a broken back transformed into a footstool. Springs from a defunct mattress were extracted to repair other furniture or create garden trellises. Nothing ever truly died. It just got demoted to a less prestigious position in the household hierarchy. This creative reuse of materials reflected a broader philosophy of making do with less, which became the essential mindset of Depression-era survival. Minimalism wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was simply life. People didn't complain about what they didn't have. They just found ways to get by with less of everything. This wasn't trendy downsizing. It was making peace with bare necessities. For children, toys weren't purchased, but improvised. A wooden spoon became a doll. A cardboard box transformed into a fortress. Kids back then had imagination instead of batteries, and the only memory card they needed was the one in their head. Furniture wasn't about style, but function. Many families owned just enough chairs for everyone to sit at the table, and sometimes not even that. Space was utilized with military precision. Tables served as desks during the day and dining surfaces at night. Meals were stripped down to essentials. The Depression diet wasn't something people chose to lose weight, though that sometimes happened anyway. This ability to make do with less relied heavily on neighbors helping neighbors when times get tough. Neighborhood cooperation during the Great Depression became the invisible safety net when government assistance was minimal. Communities developed systems of mutual aid that kept people fed, housed, and clothed through the darkest economic times. Neighbors organized food shares where everyone contributed what they could. These weren't charity cases. They were cooperative insurance policies where everyone paid premiums in whatever form they could. Childcare became a community responsibility. Parents would take turns watching neighborhood children, allowing others to work or search for jobs. Skills and tools were community property. Knowledge wasn't power. It was something you poured into your neighbor's cups when their own ran dry. With little access to professional services of any kind, people learned to take matters into their own hands. Home remedies during the Great Depression weren't just preferred, they were often the only option. With doctors charging fees few could afford and hospitals reserved for dire emergencies, families became their own medical providers. The medicine cabinet looked quite different back then. Honey and lemon mixtures soothed sore throats. Onion poultices were placed on chests to break up congestion. A hot toddy wasn't just a drink, it was penicillin with a pleasant side effect. Whiskey became the multi-purpose treatment for toothaches, colds, and nerves. Dental problems posed particular challenges. Toothaches were treated with clove oil, aspirin applied directly to gums, or in desperate cases, extraction by whoever had the steadiest hand. The family member with pliers suddenly became the most popular person in the house until you needed them. But when professional help was financially out of reach, people had to do something. Pretending became a survival skill during the Great Depression. When families couldn't afford basic comforts, they developed clever ways to maintain dignity through imitation and substitution. Coffee stretching became an art form. Real coffee beans were mixed with everything from chicory to roasted dandelion roots. The morning cup tasted so different that drinkers eventually convinced themselves that burnt toast grounds had a robust flavor profile. If a meal was small, you filled up on water and told yourself it was good portion control. Children were especially creative at pretending. A cardboard box wasn't just a box, but a spaceship or castle. People didn't just make do, they made do with style. This persistent optimism reflected how people through the Depression. Resilience during the Great Depression wasn't just a personality trait, it was the essential life hack that helped millions survive. What separated those who made it through wasn't just luck or resources, it was a particular way of thinking. People focused on what they could control rather than dwelling on what they couldn't. Problems weren't roadblocks, they were puzzles waiting to be solved. Humor became a powerful coping mechanism. When times are darkest, laughter isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. People maintained a longer view of history. They understood that economic cycles happened, that hard times had come before and would pass. This too shall pass. It might pass like a kidney stone, but it will pass. These life hacks weren't just clever tricks, they were the foundation of survival.